Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Jim Minsel, host of AZ Illustrated Politics, our weekly commentary and analysis of local, state, and national news. On tonight's show, we'll speak one-on-one with Republican Christie Jones about why she wants to be governor. Then we'll sit down with National Republican Congressional Committee spokesman Daniel Scarpinato and Democratic political consultant McLeod to look ahead to this year's congressional races. That's all coming up next on AZ Illustrated Politics, but first, a look at today's top stories.
Just before midnight, the Arizona House passed its version of a state budget. This morning, the Senate made some procedural moves to set up hearings and debates for the plan next week. The House budget has more spending in it than the Senate proposal. Specifically, it sets aside $33 million to continue a program allowing public school districts to convert some schools to charter schools. The House also added $3 million more than the Senate for Child Protective Services. Governor Brewer asked for more CPS money than either chamber is putting in right now. The House also gave $2.5 million to the University of Arizona. U.S. House Speaker John Boehner will be in Tucson tomorrow for a $500 a plate fundraiser for Republican congressional candidates Martha McSally and Andy Tobin. Both are trying to unseat Southern Arizona Democratic incumbents. Officials with the National Republican Party say they are putting a priority on Arizona's congressional races. 3 of Arizona's congressional Democrats are considered vulnerable at the ballot box this year. Local Democrats say they'll protest the speaker's visit. And the University of Arizona basketball team takes on the University of Wisconsin in the Elite Eight round of the NCAA men's basketball tournament tomorrow night. There's more than a trip to the Final Four on the line, however. Governor Brewer has a bet going with the Wisconsin governor on the outcome. And that's a look at tonight's headlines.
Former GoDaddy.com General Counsel Christie Jones is one of more than a half dozen Republicans running for governor this year. Ms. Jones, welcome to AZ Illustrated Politics.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, a lot of people don't know who you are. Tell us about why you are running for governor.
Well, I am Christie Jones. I'm a Republican candidate for governor now, but I always wasn't a candidate for governor. Once upon a time, I was a business executive, and as you mentioned, I came here, at least in my immediate past, as general counsel and executive vice president at a little startup technology company in North Scottsdale with the crazy name GoDaddy. And I was there for about 11 years. During that time, you know, when I went to GoDaddy, you have to put your head back kind of in the space that the internet was at back in late 2001. It was just a little startup entrepreneurial adventure with a few dozen employees, and over the decade that I was there, we worked really hard and we grew till we ended up selling the company. We had about 4,000 employees, providing businesses to small businesses and entrepreneurs all over the world, about 12 million of them. So it's a great Arizona story. That's in a nutshell kind of who I am. Why am I running? I really believe that we have an opportunity in Arizona to cast a vision for the future, to focus on economic development and developing excellent models of education and enforcing immigration law, to make us a model for other states to follow. And just because I have kind of this unique blend of life experiences and a desire to apply my leadership to the good of the state, I am running for governor, and I really think for this time I'm well suited for it.
One of the most controversial things in the last legislative session was the expansion of Medicaid. Governor Brewer pushed that through over the objections of many Republicans. If that were to be repealed by a future legislature, would you sign that repeal?
To sign the actual repeal
to reverse the expansion
of the expansion. Okay, just want to make sure I understand the question because I get this one a lot in different forms. I think I've said several times in the past I would have done that differently if I had been the governor, but if the legislature in the future were to repeal it and send it to me, I guess obviously one has to take a look at what the exact language is, but I would be inclined to repeal at least some form of it, because I think that in order for us to be effective we have to look at legislation by what happens with the numbers. And I'm a CPA. I just look at things kind of on the numbers and how we pay for them. If I were to do it or had a chance to do it again, I probably would have put in an absolute limit on the number of days that able-bodied people could be on the benefit. And then importantly, have a limit on the number of Arizonans who could actually take advantage of it at any one time, so that when federal funding for this starts to go away, and we know kind of by definition that it will over a phase-out period, that when the burden is resting solely on the shoulders of Arizona taxpayers, that there's a way to pay and there's a way forward in terms of reducing the obligation to the Arizona taxpayers.
Many Republican lawmakers want the state to opt out of the National Common Core testing program. What do you think of the Common Core testing program? I'm
not in favor of it, but can I elaborate a little bit?
Absolutely.
So my husband's a career military officer, and we moved around for a long time, but we got here in the 90s, and he eventually retired and became a school teacher. And so we've kind of been living at a grassroots level, day-to-day basis in the classroom and seeing how Common Core is affecting the ability of teachers to actually teach students. And while I'm very much in favor of standards, and I believe that we should have a rigorous environment for our kids to achieve academically, I'm not convinced that setting a standard at a national level where either some corporate interest that wants to sell hardware and software or some bureaucrat 2,500 miles away in Washington really has the best interest or even an understanding of what's going on in an Arizona classroom. So to my mind, if we are to have standards, and I think we should, they should be set in the state and applied at a local level so that individual students have experiences where they actually are in an environment to learn and not just to teach to a test, because frankly, I'm not convinced that we've been educating kids all that well against the standards that we have.
Now, the state Supreme Court has said that the state's empowerment scholarship program, which allows tax dollars to essentially go to private schools via these scholarships, is constitutional, although vouchers are not. And opponents of this say that these are essentially vouchers. Supporters say that you're creating more school choice. And some lawmakers want to expand the program to include far more Arizona students. Your thoughts on whether this should be expanded?
Well, I know the legislature took some action on this recently, so, and I don't have whatever they did memorized, but notwithstanding that, I actually believe that Arizona has done a very fine job of establishing school choice, maybe among the most well-developed in the nation. And really, it strikes me that the choice of education and the type of education for each child should be made by the parent. So to that end, I'm very much in favor of school choice. Whether education dollars should be directed differently depending on the type of school, whether it's a private school or a public school or a charter school or homeschool, online school, all of the different kinds of choices. I'm not convinced that we ought to be distinguishing between a successful version and an unsuccessful version. What I do know and what I want to emphasize to people is a lot of spending that goes on in education in Arizona in the 220-something school districts that we have that's duplicative and ineffective and inefficient. And we really should be focusing on, instead of fighting between charter and private and public and homeschool, we really should be fighting to get more money to educate students. A bigger percentage of the $9 billion we spend on education needs to get to the classroom.
You've said that you opposed SB 1062, which was the very controversial law that the governor vetoed earlier this year. But you said there were legitimate issues of religious freedom at stake in this particular legislation. And at present, gays and lesbians are not a protected class in Arizona. Should it be legal in Arizona to fire someone simply because they are gay?
Okay, so firing somebody because they're gay doesn't have anything to do with 1062. Just want to make sure I understand the question.
Right.
Okay.
No, it's a question of whether we should extend legal protection to gays and lesbians.
Here's what I asked the next morning after that passed for the legislature actually to withdraw the bill. I didn't really think the governor should be in the position of having to veto or sign it. I never thought it should have got that far in the first place, because while religious liberty is very important, and I love that people in the legislature care about it. I care about it. It's the single most fundamental principle upon which this country was founded. I think we ought not to be creating problems or solving problems that don't exist. If I had had the chance to lead through that and navigate through that journey, I think I probably would have said, you know what, today let's talk about what we're really focused on in this legislative session. Here is the agenda, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to focus on economic development, and should this present a problem, then we'll solve for it. We will ensure that no citizen could ever be compelled to provide professional services that would violate their deeply held religious belief or their conscience, because that's what's provided for in the Constitution. But today, since it's not a problem, let's not create problems or solve problems that don't exist.
Right, and at the moment, since gays and lesbians are not a protected class, you can already refuse service to them. And that's why I'm wondering, do you think that gays and lesbians should have the protections that women have or various ethnic groups have?
Well, under the current law, there are, 5 protected classes? And some states have taken measures to add classes to that.
The gays and lesbians.
Gay and lesbian being one of them, some additional disabilities and things like that. And that really, and one of the reasons I'm running for governor is the voice of that has to go to the people. And if that is to be expanded in this state, that is an issue that people should decide. This is not an issue for a little special interest or some lobbyist or somebody has a financial interest in seeing that class expanded. That's not where that voice needs to come from. That actually should be a voice of the citizens of the state of Arizona, the people that I represent. Their will should be done on this.
And do you think gays and lesbians should have the freedom to marry? At the moment, of course, it's a constitutional amendment prohibits that, but there is talk that another constitutional amendment could be put on the ballot to eliminate that restriction.
Okay. That was a couple double negatives. Let me just tell you where I stand.
Sure.
I'm personally in favor of traditional marriage. I'm in a traditional marriage. I have been for 27 years. I'm married to the single nicest guy known to mankind. I feel very fortunate to have found that mate. Nevertheless, it is important that we have legislators and leadership in this state who understand how the Constitution interacts with the church. Specifically prohibits the state from enacting laws that affect the ability of people to engage in religious activities. Marriage, to my mind, is an activity for the church. If your church doesn't want to marry gay people, the state cannot make it marry gay people. And if your church wants to marry gay people, the state cannot prohibit it from marrying gay people. In the end, we are Americans and we are about freedom. And what we will seek is to let people live and let other people live. But the state, under my watch, will not interfere with the church in its decision about whether to marry gay people, straight people, or anybody in between, because that is not the role of the governor and that is not the role of the state. That is to private citizens to decide.
Well, yeah, but the state does have a role in the civil contract that occurs between married people, and right now, gays and lesbians are not allowed to marry. If that were to be put onto the ballot, would you support the ability of gays and lesbians to be able to marry? Again,
I think marriage is an issue for the church. If you're talking about unions, that may be an issue for the state. As it exists today, as you noted, we have a constitutional amendment that defines marriage as between one man and one woman. So that's where we have to live until the citizens of the state either repeal that or change it. But I think it's really important for us not to get wrapped around the axle about these issues, because the Constitution is a document that has sustained and existed, and one that I have personally defended repeatedly, both at GoDaddy and since, because of its simplicity. And if we really try to complicate it, or we try to shave off rights, or we try to put stuff in there that never was intended to be there, we unnecessarily complicate issues. If I would make a bold prediction, my sense is this issue, as we go forward, will boil down one day to benefits. And just, you can mark my words, it's 2014. One day in this country, there will be the ability for each person to designate one beneficiary for their benefits. And that is where this issue is going to land.
So we are out of time, but thank you for coming by AZ Illustrated Politics.
Thank you so much for having me. We always run out of time, but I'll be back anytime you want me to come back. Thanks for having me.
Very good. And we will be right back with our roundtable discussion.
I'm Gwen Eiffel on the next news hour. Iran and Syria top the agenda when President Obama visits Saudi Arabia. Plus the analysis of Shields and Brooks. That's Friday on the PBS NewsHour.
Tonight, Arizona Week with Lorraine Rivera takes an in-depth look at the Arizona-Mexico border, including a group documenting the deadly trek north for many migrants. That's tonight at 8:30 on PBS 6.
Two of Arizona's three competitive congressional districts include precincts in southern Arizona. Congressional District 2 is represented by Democrat Ron Barber, who is facing a likely rematch with Republican Martha McSally, who is favored to win her four-way primary. Congressional District 1, which includes both southern and northern Arizona, is now represented by Democrat Ann Kirkpatrick, who will face the winner of a three-way Republican primary that includes House Speaker Andy Tobin, State Representative Adam Quasman, and rancher Gary Keeney. Joining me to talk about how these congressional races are shaping up, National Republican Congressional Committee spokesman Daniel Scarpinato and Democratic strategist Rod McLeod, who is working on Congressman Barber's re-election campaign. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Let's talk about what are likely to be the key issues in this campaign. Rod, we learned this week that 6 million people have now signed up for Obamacare via the exchanges. What do you make of that?
Well, I think after a disastrous start and rollout of the website, the healthcare.gov, which is only one part of Obamacare, the administration seems to have got that back on track. You know, there's another 3.5 million people who are getting their health insurance from the Medicaid expansion, which has been supported bipartisanly. Here in Arizona, our governor, Jan Brewer, Republican, has supported that, though, you know, she got some pushback from many in her party. But you know, that's one way, that's one plan, but the Republicans also have a plan. And the Republican plan is to put the insurance companies back in charge of your health care. So if you get sick, you can get thrown off your insurance if they get tired of paying, or they can charge women more for premiums, or they can deny you coverage for the care you need if you have a so-called pre-existing condition. So, you know, you've got a real difference in the way that two parties view what we're going to do with health care. The Republican plan is to put insurance companies back in charge. And on the Democratic side, we've got some differences, even between the two members of Congress we're talking about. You know, Ron Barber, for instance, has really taken on President Obama and, you know, looked for major changes to the law. But he's not willing to go back to letting the insurance companies take over.
Daniel, I'll give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously disagree tremendously. Keep in mind that the insurance companies actually helped write Obamacare, first of all. So this is not exactly taking on the insurance companies. I think that the fact is that the 6 million, you know, a year ago, they said 8 million. So they've actually lowered their own threshold, moved the goalpost, and 30 million people remain uninsured. So if the goal of Obamacare was to insure more people and lower premiums, it's failed at both. It's also stifled job growth, and both of the local members of Congress here, Ann Kirkpatrick and Ron Barber, have been responsible for that. They continue to support Obamacare. Kirkpatrick voted for the original bill. And I don't think Ron Barber is taking on the administration in one bit. I think that he is fearing his next election, as they all are, because they were the first supporters of this. Ron Barber actually said in his 2012 campaign that he didn't have a position on Obamacare. It turned out actually he had supported the bill way back in its infancy.
Well, none of that's true. I mean, Ron Barber said very clearly that he did have a position on the repeal of Obamacare. He would vote against it, but that there were things he wanted to change. And since he got to Congress, that's what he's done. He's supporting laws and voting for laws to get rid of the fines, to delay them, to get rid of the medical device tax. He voted for the Keep Your Plan Act. And some of these are laws that come out of your party that he's working across the aisle to support. He also recently had an op-ed and a letter to the president on the president's proposal for Medicare Advantage, where the president wanted to make changes to that Ron didn't agree with. I mean, Ron doesn't feel like he is working for the president or the Democratic Party. He's working for the people here in southern Arizona.
Well, you know, to me, it's kind of like the bank robber who gets caught and wants to give the money back. The fact is that when it mattered, both of these representatives supported Obamacare. They've continued support keeping it in place. And the fact is all this stuff that Rod is mentioning, the good things that people of both parties support. I think when we repeal and place Obamacare, everyone's on the record agreeing that we should keep those things in place, that women shouldn't be treated unfairly, that pre-existing conditions should be covered, but they should be part of a plan that's patient-centered and that actually lowers costs and increases coverage, which Obamacare isn't doing.
Well, it is doing if you read the research. I mean, the Gallup poll shows that we've got the lowest number of uninsured is going down. I mean, you guys ran the Congress and the White House for a long time and had no plan at all.
Well, come on,
So
come
what
on.
we're actually starting to do is bring down costs.
Oh, come on.
Medicare costs are down. Prescription drug costs
People
are
are
down.
losing their plans. People got letters that they were losing their plans.
You get that letter all the time.
30 million people are uninsured.
Let me
30
step in
million.
here because
used to
I'm
be
wondering,
50
are we
million.
going to see an actual alternative to Obamacare passed in the House of Representatives?
Well, look, there's a lot of alternatives. In fact, they were put forward back when Nancy Pelosi pushed through this bill, and none of them were entertained by the Democrats. I think the fact is even anything House Republicans do is going to die at Harry Reid's doorstep because he won't entertain anything. The Democrats have become obsessed with supporting Obamacare and protecting Obamacare and refuse to do anything to replace it. And that's really a shame. And as a result, the two local representatives here,
That's
Ann
not
Kirkpatrick
true.
and Ron
We just
Barber,
got through
are in very competitive races because
Ron-
these
but
are
we-
unpopular
Time out.
things.
But we
Ron
had-
Barber
we-
has actually made suggested many changes to Obamacare. So when you say they don't want to replace it with anything, they do want to fix it. And that's what the American people want. They don't want to repeal it.
The law is not working.
The law's working
It's
in
not
many
working.
cases.
Okay.
Not in the
this-
case of people who are losing their insurance or seniors who are losing
I have
in-home
car insurance. I get a
services.
letter every year from my insurance company for my car. They say, important changes to your policy. That always happens. It happens with your credit card. It happens with your insurance.
Clearly-
That's not people
Well,
losing
well,
their
but I
health
think
care.
this
I
is
think
good. I
this
think
is-
that's what I
this
think they
is
should keep going
clearly-
out there and defending
Clearly,
Obamacare if
we
they
can
think
see a
it's great.
preview of what we're going to see on the campaign trail this year. But let's shift gears to immigration. Daniel, Democrats are pushing the idea of a discharge petition in the House this week to try to force the Senate's comprehensive immigration bill out onto the House floor for a vote. Will this discharge petition be successful?
Probably not. It's been over a decade since the discharge petition has been successful. And moreover, this just isn't good policy. You know, the last thing we need is an Obamacare-style bill that nobody's read and that people in Washington pass in the middle of the night. You know, this is not the right direction. We need to take a step-by-step approach to this. People don't want this monstrosity of a bill that nobody's even taken the time to read. Only in Washington would that be considered the way to go. Talk to the folks down at the border who are dealing with this as a real-life issue every day, and they'll tell you that the border still is not secured.
Well, Ron Barber does talk to the folks down at the border. He represents them, and that's why he's pushed for so much border security money in this bill. Surprised to see you viciously attack Senator McCain and Senator Flake for not reading the bill they voted for. And the fact is that we've been arguing about this since John Kyle and John McCain came out with a similar bill in 2006. And the Republicans in the House of Representatives, they just don't want a bill because they know that if this bill passes, we'll create jobs, the economy will get better, and then they won't be able to win elections by saying Obama destroyed the economy. This is a bill that passed the Senate with Democratic and Republican support. This is a bill that the United States Chamber of Commerce supports.
That doesn't make a good policy.
We should be working together to get this bill to secure our border, reunite families, and move our economy in the right direction. But the master of obstruction, Mr. Boehner, won't do it. So he's just going to go play some golf tomorrow at an elite golf course and help Martha McSally and Andy Tobin raise money because they're going to help him obstruct progress.
No.
And we're not going to.
Come on.
He's
No,
not
no.
going to play
No,
golf? Let me go on the record. Will he or
Republicans-
will he not play golf tomorrow?
Rod, I don't know, but I will tell you this, is that Republicans want to deal with this issue, but we have to take a step-by-step approach. And we have to make sure that the folks who are really facing this issue on the border, in this district, in this community, that they're the ones deciding that the border is secured, not people in Washington, not us in the comfort of this studio, but those folks who are dealing with it as a real life, not a rhetorical issue.
Representative
One of the things,
democracy,
let me
it's the people who
step
go
in
to
here, Rod.
Congress
Let
who are
me-
supposed to
Yeah.
Let
And
me
so-
hold on. Let me ask Daniel about one of the key sticking points I hear from a lot of people is what to do about the undocumented people now in the United States. And the Senate bill does have a 13-year path to citizenship included in that. The House Republicans leadership came out with a set of principles that said that folks who are in the country illegally now should be allowed to stay here but not be put on a path to citizenship, and then the DREAM Act kids would be allowed to have citizenship. And are we going to see legislation like that emerge from the House issue?
I think it needs to be step by step, and I think all of it needs to be vetted in the light of day. And so when Rod talks about all this stuff that the Senate bill supposedly does, we haven't read it. People have not looked at this in enough detail, and we saw what happened with Obamacare. It was a total disaster. and we can't afford to let that happen again.
The fact that the bill passed in the Senate last year in the spring, you're admitting that your bosses haven't taken the time to read it. I think.
Well, have you read it? I mean, who here has read it? Has anybody read this thing?
I'm not the Speaker of the House. Maybe Mr. Boehner should be impeached for not reading the bill.
You are talking about how great the bill is. So, if we haven't studied it in detail, if we haven't read it, then how can we say that? And
right.
I just don't think this is not what the American people want.
We haven't done the reading yet.
You know what? That's what they said with Obamacare. This is not what the American people want. They want a step-by-step process, not something crammed through in the dark of the night in Washington when people have not actually looked at this in detail. It's not the right approach.
We've been legislating this issue and this package since McCain started with Kyle back in 2006. If that's crammed through, you have an interesting choice of words.
All right, I want to mention it. Rod mentioned that the John Boehner will be in town for this fundraiser. I've heard people complain on the Republican side that the NRCC is now taking sides in these primaries. Daniel, and I thought I'd give you a chance to respond to this.
Yeah, no, that's not the case. What I think it is illustrative of is the fact that Southern Arizona has two of the most important congressional races in the country that will quite literally decide if Nancy Pelosi is ever Speaker of the House again. And Speaker Boehner has done more than anyone to stay on offense, to take the fight to the Democrats, to help Republican candidates across the country. I think that's what he's doing here. And one of the things I'm doing while I'm here in Arizona is traveling through these districts, talking as supporters of all the candidates in the primaries. And what I'll tell you is that in Arizona 1 in particular, the Ann Kirkpatrick district, that it doesn't matter who people are supporting. They all say we have to defeat Ann Kirkpatrick in November, and we're going to be united behind whoever the nominee is.
And Rod, what do you make of Speaker Boehner's appearance here?
Well, he obviously needs more help obstructing progress in Congress, and that's why he's going to shovel money towards Andy Tobin and Martha McSally, because he knows that when he wants to pass our Paul Ryan plan that shreds Medicare or gives giant tax cuts to millionaires and raises taxes on middle-class families, that he needs backup. And don't trust me, this is what the AARP says about these bills.
This is a very honest difference of opinion. Rod, Ann Kirkpatrick, and Ron Barber want Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. So obviously they wouldn't support John Boehner coming here to help our candidates. So they want Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. We don't. I think that's an important distinction because the fact is if she were Speaker of the House again, there would be zero oversight or transparency of anything, particularly Obamacare.
All right, we've got less than a minute left. I want 30 seconds left, so it's really not enough time to get into the details of the SB 1062, which was passed by the legislature, vetoed by the governor. Andy Tobin and Adam Quasman both voted for that. But briefly, you think that will play any kind of role in this campaign? Daniel, 10 seconds.
Not really. I mean, I agree with Mitt Romney, and I'm glad that this did not become law. I don't think it was the right direction for our state. But I think people are more concerned with a bill that actually is the law of the land today, and that's Obamacare. And I think that's what this race is going to be about.
Andy Tobin took this terrible bill which would have legalized discrimination against our gay family members and community members, and he put it on a fast track, crammed it through the legislature in one day, not 8 years, and everybody mostly came together and said it was the wrong thing to do.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank both of you to come in here. It gave us a good preview of what's coming up, I think, this year, and we will be right back with some closing thoughts. That's our show for today, but you can learn more about politics by visiting news.azpm.org or by following us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Jim Ninsel. Thanks for watching another edition of AZ Illustrated Politics.